What kind of question could make someone walk away from the one person they trusted most, right in the middle of a live podcast watched by millions? Everything seemed warm and effortless until Jungkook asked a single deeply personal question that instantly shattered Jimin's composure. Without a word, Jimin removed his microphone, walked out of the studio, and left behind a silence so painful that even the cameras seemed frozen. No one understood what had just happened, but everyone could feel an old wound had been torn open again. If you were in Jimin's place, what would you have done? And what heartbreaking truth was powerful enough to destroy a bond that once seemed unbreakable? Jimin and Jungkook had always shared a connection that seemed stronger than words, a bond forged through years of relentless training, unforgettable performances, quiet victories, and difficult moments that only the two of them truly understood. To millions of fans, they represented unwavering trust and genuine affection, effortlessly supporting each other through every challenge placed before them. As the recording began, every smile appeared effortless and every answer sounded sincere, creating the comforting illusion that nothing had changed between Jimin and Jungkook. Guided the conversation through familiar memories, unforgettable performances, and the challenges of growing together under constant public attention. The audience laughed along with nostalgic stories, while the production crew relaxed, convinced they were witnessing another heartfelt conversation that would strengthen the image of two people whose bond had survived every storm. Yet beneath that polished surface, both of them carried emotions that had been quietly growing heavier for months, hidden behind professionalism and carefully rehearsed expressions. Long before the podcast invitation had arrived, Jimin had begun making silent decisions that no one around him fully understood. He often accepted responsibilities that were never meant to be his, willingly taking criticism whenever difficult situations threatened the people he cared about. He convinced himself that protecting Jungkook from unnecessary pressure was worth every personal sacrifice, even if it meant carrying misunderstandings that slowly isolated him from everyone else. Each sacrifice remained invisible because Jimin never searched for recognition. Instead, he buried every painful memory deeper inside his heart, believing that one day the truth would no longer matter as long as Jungkook continued smiling without guilt. Jungkook, however, saw only the growing distance. Every unanswered message, every cancelled late-night conversation, and every moment when Jimin quietly excused himself planted another seed of uncertainty inside his mind. What once felt like unconditional trust gradually transformed into confusion. He questioned whether success had changed their priorities or whether an invisible wall had been built between them without his knowledge. The more he searched for answers, the less he understood Jimin's silence. Instead of recognizing sacrifice, he mistook it for avoidance, and that misunderstanding slowly became the deepest wound either of them had ever carried. Taehyung wrestled with an impossible choice. The atmosphere inside the studio remained calm on the surface, yet an invisible pressure settled over every passing minute. The hosts continued guiding the conversation toward increasingly personal reflections, believing that honest emotions would create the most memorable episode of the season. Every topic felt harmless at first, touching on perseverance, friendship, and the sacrifices required to grow under the constant weight of public expectations. The audience watching the live broadcast admired the sincerity filling the room, unaware that each carefully chosen question was leading both Jimin and Jungkook closer to a painful memory neither of them was emotionally prepared to face. Jimin maintained his gentle smile with remarkable discipline, but inside, his thoughts became increasingly difficult to control. Every mention of loyalty reminded him of the promise he had made years earlier, a promise that had slowly become the foundation of every difficult decision he had taken since. He remembered countless nights spent convincing himself that silence was the greatest gift he could offer someone he cared about so deeply. Even though the burden had gradually stolen his peace, he never allowed himself to regret the choice. If protecting Jungkook meant carrying blame forever, then he believed that was simply the price of genuine devotion. Across from him, Jungkook felt an entirely different battle unfolding. Then everything changed in an instant. Encouraged by the emotional tone of the interview and driven by months of unanswered doubts, Jungkook gathered the courage to confront the one question that had haunted him in silence. His expression carried no anger, only vulnerability, regret, and the desperate hope that honesty could finally heal what time had failed to repair. The words left his heart with complete sincerity, never intending to accuse or wound. Yet the moment the question filled the studio, it struck Jimin like a memory he had spent years desperately trying to bury. The color slowly drained from Jimin's face. His breathing became uneven as every hidden sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every painful promise rushed back into his mind at once. For a long moment, he remained completely still, unable to hide the heartbreak reflected in his eyes. Around him, the entire studio fell into a silence so profound that even the production crew forgot to move. No one understood why a single heartfelt question had caused such visible pain, but everyone could feel that the answer was connected to a truth far greater than anyone had ever imagined. Without looking at Jungkook, Jimin quietly removed the microphone attached to his jacket. His trembling hands revealed a vulnerability he had never allowed the public to witness before. He stood slowly, fighting to maintain the dignity that years of discipline had taught him, yet every step toward the studio exit carried the unbearable weight of memories that refused to remain hidden any longer. Jungkook could only watch in stunned disbelief, realizing too late that his search for the truth had unintentionally reopened the deepest wound in the heart of the person he had been trying to understand all along. Behind them, Taehyung closed his eyes in quiet despair, knowing that the moment he had feared for years had finally arrived, and that the devastating truth could no longer remain buried. The heavy studio door closed behind Jimin with a quiet sound that somehow echoed louder than any applause the room had ever known. Outside the studio, Jimin struggled to steady his breathing as he walked through the dimly lit hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because of anger, but because years of carefully buried memories had suddenly returned with unbearable force. He leaned against the cold wall, closing his eyes as waves of guilt, exhaustion, and grief overwhelmed the emotional control he had maintained for so long. He had convinced himself that silence would protect everyone he loved, yet the silence itself had become the very thing destroying the bond he had sacrificed everything to preserve. For the first time, he questioned whether carrying the burden alone had ever truly been the right choice. Taehyung quietly left the studio without attracting attention, knowing exactly where Jimin would go whenever the weight of the world became too much to carry. He found him standing alone at the end of the hallway beneath the soft glow of an emergency light, looking smaller than he ever had before despite the strength he had always shown everyone around him. Taehyung did not interrupt the silence. He understood that some moments demanded presence rather than words. Yet as he stood nearby, one painful truth became impossible to ignore. The secret Jimin had protected for years was no longer protecting anyone. It had become a prison built from love, guilt, and endless self-sacrifice. Back inside the studio, RM, Jin, Sugar, and J-Hope slowly gathered around Jungkook. None of them blamed him, but none of them could reassure him either. Every expression carried the same heartbreaking realization that they had all witnessed only fragments of a much larger story. Sugar quietly remembered details that had never seemed important until now. Jin recalled countless occasions when Jimin had accepted blame without defending himself. RM began connecting years of unexplained decisions that suddenly formed a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. J-Hope struggled to hide the tears forming in his eyes as he realized how long someone could suffer while convincing everyone else they were perfectly fine. Unable to carry the truth any longer, Taehyung finally returned to the studio, holding the confidential file he had hidden for so many years. His hands trembled as he looked toward Jungkook, knowing that opening those pages would forever change the way. The realization struck Jungkook with crushing force. The memories he had spent months interpreting as rejection were, in reality, evidence of a love so selfless that it had demanded complete silence. He remembered every time he had questioned Jimin's loyalty, every lonely night when he convinced himself that their friendship no longer mattered in the same way, and every painful assumption that had slowly built an invisible wall between them. Those thoughts now returned as unbearable regret. He understood that while he had been searching for answers, Jimin had been quietly fighting a battle that no one else had even known existed. RM closed the final folder and lowered his head, overwhelmed by the weight of what had remained hidden for so long. His years of leadership suddenly felt incomplete because someone under his care had suffered in silence while protecting the people around him. Jin wiped away tears he could no longer conceal, realizing that Jimin's brightest smiles had often appeared during the periods when his heart had been carrying its heaviest burdens. Sugar remained motionless, his expression filled with sorrow as countless forgotten moments finally connected into one heartbreaking truth. J-Hope covered his face, unable to accept that optimism alone had never been enough to notice how deeply one of the people he loved had been hurting. Taehyung quietly admitted that he had discovered fragments of the truth long ago, but had honored Jimin's desperate request to protect the secret. At the time, he believed keeping the promise was another way of respecting Jimin's sacrifice. Looking back, however, he realized that silence had slowly transformed into another form of suffering. By protecting one promise, they had unintentionally allowed misunderstanding to grow stronger than trust. That realization haunted everyone in the room because they understood that even the purest intentions could create devastating consequences when truth remained hidden for too long. Meanwhile, Jimin had already left the building unnoticed through a quiet side exit. The cold evening air offered little comfort as he wandered through nearly empty streets illuminated by scattered city lights. Every familiar sound faded beneath the overwhelming noise of memories he could no longer escape. For years he had believed that carrying pain alone was the strongest way to protect someone he loved. Now that everything had begun unraveling, he questioned whether his sacrifice had truly saved anyone at all. Instead of preserving happiness, perhaps he had only postponed heartbreak until it became impossible to survive. Far behind him, Jungkook finally found the strength to stand. His regret had transformed into determination. He no longer wanted explanations for the past, he wanted the chance to stop Jimin from believing he had to suffer alone any longer. Clutching the worn file tightly against his chest, he rushed out of the studio into the cold night, driven by the fear that every second of delay might push Jimin even farther away. For the first time in years, he understood that healing would not begin with perfect words or dramatic gestures. It would begin with the courage to face the painful truth together, no matter how much it hurt. As the distance between them slowly disappeared beneath the glow of the city lights, fate prepared one final emotional test, one that would determine whether a friendship built on sacrifice could finally be rebuilt through honesty, forgiveness, and the strength to share the weight that neither of them should ever have carried alone. As memories flowed through his mind, Jimin no longer remembered the exact day his sacrifice had begun. It had never been a single decision, but a series of small choices made out of love and loyalty. Every time another burden appeared, he simply convinced himself he could carry one more. One more misunderstanding. One more sleepless night. One more accusation left unanswered. Over time, those small sacrifices became a life he no longer recognized. The person everyone admired for his strength had quietly forgotten how to ask for help, believing that protecting someone else always mattered more than protecting himself. Jungkook finally reached the riverside after following a trail of familiar memories rather than directions. From a distance, he recognized Jimin's silhouette sitting beneath the dim glow of an old street lamp. Relief washed over him for only a brief moment before overwhelming guilt took its place. The loneliness surrounding Jimin was more heartbreaking than anything contained within the confidential file. It was the loneliness of someone who had spent years believing that suffering in silence was an act of love. Jungkook slowed his steps, understanding that this moment demanded patience rather than urgency. Some wounds could not be healed simply by finding the person who carried them. The distance between them grew smaller until only a few quiet steps remained. Jimin sensed someone approaching and slowly lifted his head. The cool night breeze moved gently through the trees as the city continued around them, unaware that two lives were quietly beginning to change forever. The future remained uncertain, and the scars left by years of silence could not disappear overnight. Yet something had already shifted. The walls built from misunderstanding had begun to crumble, replaced by a fragile but genuine hope that trust could grow stronger when carried together instead of alone. Whether that hope would be enough to heal every wound remained unknown, but one undeniable truth had finally emerged from the darkness. The deepest acts of love are not measured by the pain we hide, but by the courage we find to let someone help us carry it. Time did not erase the scars that had formed between Jimin and Jungkook, but it slowly transformed the way they carried them. In the days that followed, neither of them tried to pretend that everything had instantly returned to normal. Healing demanded something far more difficult than apologies. It required patience, honesty, and the willingness to revisit memories that had been buried beneath years of silent sacrifice. For the first time in a long while, they chose not to hide behind carefully rehearsed smiles or the expectations of the world. Instead, they allowed themselves to become vulnerable, accepting that true strength was never found in suffering alone, but in trusting someone enough to share the weight. RM quietly brought everyone together away from cameras and public attention, believing that some of life's most important moments deserved complete privacy. Jin prepared a familiar meal that reminded everyone of simpler days before misunderstandings had complicated their lives. Sugar encouraged reflection rather than blame, reminding them that even the strongest relationships could fracture when silence replaced honesty. J-Hope gradually restored laughter to the room, proving that joy could still exist after heartbreak, while Taehyung finally released the guilt he had carried for guarding a promise that had unintentionally prolonged everyone's pain. Together, they realized that weeks later, the unfinished podcast episode unexpectedly became a symbol of something far greater than public curiosity. Rather than allowing rumors to define what had happened, Jimin and Jungkook quietly agreed to return to the same studio. This time, there was no pressure to create a perfect image or convince the world that nothing had ever been wrong. Their purpose was much simpler and infinitely more meaningful. They wanted to prove that broken trust could be rebuilt, that painful truths did not always destroy relationships, and that genuine forgiveness required courage from everyone involved. When the cameras began recording once again, the atmosphere felt completely different from before. There was no invisible wall separating them anymore. The silence that once carried unbearable tension had become peaceful acceptance. Every emotion reflected on their faces spoke louder than words ever could. The audience did not witness perfection. They witnessed healing. They witnessed two hearts choosing understanding over pride and compassion over fear. That quiet transformation touched millions because it reflected a truth many people recognized within their own lives. As the recording came to an end, Jimin looked. Sometimes the greatest heartbreak is not caused by betrayal, but by love that remains unspoken for too long. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones quietly falling apart while convincing everyone else they are perfectly fine. And sometimes the most powerful act of courage is not making another sacrifice, but allowing someone you trust to help carry your pain. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. If you were in Jimin's place, would you have kept the painful secret to protect someone you loved, or would you have revealed the truth before silence broke both of your hearts? Only days after the emotional reunion, life appeared to settle into a quieter rhythm, yet peace often arrives just before another storm. The unfinished podcast remained the center of endless speculation, with countless theories spreading across social media and headlines questioning what had truly happened behind the cameras. Although neither Jimin nor Jungkook responded publicly, the growing attention placed fresh pressure on hearts that were only beginning to heal. They chose silence once again, but this time it was no longer the silence of hidden sacrifice. It was the silence of two people protecting the fragile trust they had finally rebuilt together. Even so, neither of them realized that someone else had been carefully watching every development, waiting for the perfect moment to reopen wounds that had barely begun to close. Inside the company archives, an old storage room was being cleared before a scheduled renovation. Among forgotten boxes of production notes, rehearsal footage, and confidential files, an employee discovered an unmarked envelope sealed years earlier. Believing it contained routine administrative records, the envelope was forwarded to management without anyone recognizing its significance. Hidden inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and a memory card that had never been reviewed. The materials documented events surrounding the same incident Jimin had quietly taken responsibility for years ago, but they also revealed something no one had ever considered. The truth Jimin had protected had not been accidental. Someone had deliberately manipulated the situation, allowing blame to fall where it would cause the greatest emotional damage while remaining completely invisible. When Taehyung was unexpectedly asked to help organize the recovered materials, a familiar feeling of unease returned almost instantly. As he carefully examined each page, Small details began connecting in ways that made his heart race. Dates that had never matched, missing reports that suddenly reappeared, and unfamiliar signatures hidden among official documents suggested that the painful misunderstandings separating Jimin and Jungkook had never been the result of fate alone. There had been unseen hands quietly guiding events from the shadows. The realization chilled him because it meant the sacrifice that had shaped so many years of heartbreak might have been built upon a carefully orchestrated deception. Before anyone else could understand the full meaning of what had been uncovered, Taehyung knew one terrifying truth with absolute certainty. The story they believed had finally ended was only the beginning of a far deeper mystery. Taehyung spent the entire night reviewing every document, photograph, and digital file, refusing to accept conclusions until every detail aligned. The more carefully he examined the recovered evidence, the more unsettling the pattern became. Nothing appeared dramatic when viewed individually, yet together the pieces formed a sequence of calculated decisions that had quietly altered the lives of everyone involved. Important emails had been redirected, meeting schedules had been changed at the last minute, and critical information had disappeared just long enough to create misunderstandings that no one questioned at the time. What had once seemed like unfortunate coincidence now carried the unmistakable outline of deliberate manipulation. The weight of that discovery left Taehyung facing another impossible decision. Revealing the evidence immediately could protect Jimin and Jungkook from further deception, but it could also reopen emotional wounds that had only just begun to heal. Remaining silent, however, risked allowing the unknown mastermind to continue hiding behind years of carefully constructed lies. He remembered the regret of keeping the previous secret for too long and promised himself that history would not repeat itself. This time, the truth had to emerge before another sacrifice was made. The following morning, RM quietly gathered Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, Taehyung, Jimin, and Jungkook in a private meeting room away from cameras and public attention. The atmosphere was calm, yet everyone sensed that the seriousness on Taehyung's face carried news capable of changing everything once again. Jimin noticed the thick folder resting on the table and felt a familiar tension return to his. As Taehyung carefully laid out the recovered materials, every new page revealed another hidden inconsistency buried within the past. There were records of conversations that never reached the intended recipients, revisions made without authorization, and anonymous instructions that had quietly influenced critical decisions years earlier. None of it proved who was responsible, but it proved something even more disturbing. The misunderstanding that nearly destroyed Jimin and Jungkook's relationship had never grown naturally. Someone had nurtured it from the shadows, ensuring that silence, doubt, and guilt would continue growing until they overwhelmed both of them. No one reached for the note immediately. It rested on the table like a quiet warning, its simple sentence. Late that evening, as Taehyung reviewed the recovered memory card one final time, a file appeared that no one had noticed before. Hidden beneath an ordinary file name was a short video recorded from a distant security camera years earlier. The footage was grainy and incomplete, but one shadowy figure could be seen placing a sealed envelope onto a production desk only minutes before the misunderstanding that changed everything began. Just before the recording ended, the person briefly turned toward the camera. The face remained hidden in darkness, but a distinctive ring on one hand reflected the light for a fraction of a second. Taehyung immediately paused the video. His heartbeat quickened as he recognized the ring. He had seen it before, not recently, but often enough that the memory refused to disappear. He leaned closer to the screen, searching desperately for another clue, yet the footage ended before revealing the person's identity. The room fell silent once again. They were closer to the truth than ever before, but the greatest mysteries still remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for the moment when one final revelation would change everything they thought they knew. Taehyung replayed the footage over and over, slowing every frame until the movement became almost imperceptible. The reflection from the ring lasted less than a second, yet it was enough to awaken a memory he had ignored for years. He remembered seeing that same distinctive design during preparations for a major project long before the misunderstanding had divided Jimin and Jungkook. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary piece of jewelry, something too insignificant to remember. Now it had become the only visible clue connecting the hidden figure to the events that had changed so many lives. Rather than rushing to conclusions, RM insisted that every possibility be tested carefully. No one wanted another misunderstanding to grow from assumptions. They compared old photographs, backstage videos, and archived rehearsal footage, hoping to identify the owner of the ring without accusing anyone unfairly. Hours passed as they searched through years of forgotten memories, and with every new image the tension inside the room continued to rise. The closer they came to an answer, the more they realized that the truth might involve someone they had once trusted completely. Jimin watched the investigation unfold with mixed emotions. Although he desperately wanted the truth, another part of him feared what it might reveal. He had finally accepted that the years of pain could not be changed, but discovering that someone had intentionally guided those events would create a different kind of wound. It would force everyone to question memories they had always believed were genuine. Even so, he refused to turn away. After spending so many years hiding from past, he understood that the only path forward was through complete honesty, no matter how painful it became. Late that night, one of the archived photographs finally drew Sugar's attention. In the background, nearly hidden among a crowd of staff members, stood the same distinctive ring. The person's face was partially obscured, but another detail immediately stood out. Around the individual's neck hung an official access badge that had been deactivated years earlier. RM quickly cross-referenced the badge number with old company records. The file appeared for only a brief moment before displaying a message that froze everyone in place. The employee connected to that badge had officially resigned just 2 days after the incident that changed Jimin and Jungkook's lives, and every record of their work inside the company had mysteriously disappeared soon afterward. No one spoke as the significance of the discovery settled over the room. Someone had not only vanished from the company, but had seemingly erased their own history at the same time. Whether they had acted alone or for someone else remained unknown, but one fact could no longer be ignored. The truth had been hidden with remarkable precision, suggesting that the misunderstanding between Jimin and Jungkook was never meant to be resolved. As RM quietly closed the file, a notification suddenly appeared on the office computer. An anonymous email had just arrived. It contained no message, no explanation, and no sender's name, only a single attachment titled "If you really want the truth." RM hesitated before opening the attachment, understanding that a single click could either expose the truth they had spent years searching for or pull them into an even deeper web of deception. The room remained silent as every pair of eyes focused on the glowing computer screen. Jimin and Jungkook exchanged a brief glance filled not with fear, but with quiet determination. Whatever waited inside that file, they had already promised themselves they would face it together instead of allowing another secret to separate them. The attachment slowly loaded, revealing a collection of scanned documents, timestamps, and surveillance stills accompanied by an unsigned statement. Rather than identifying a culprit, the material suggested that several key records surrounding the old incident had been intentionally altered before anyone had the chance to review them. The evidence pointed toward deliberate interference, but it stopped short of naming any individual. Whoever assembled the file seemed more interested in exposing the existence of the cover-up than accusing a specific person, leaving the group with more questions than answers. Jimin felt an unexpected sense of relief mixed with sorrow. For so long he had believed every painful consequence had been the unavoidable result of his own choices. Now he finally understood that although his sacrifices had been real, the circumstances surrounding them had been shaped by information that was never completely truthful. The years he had spent blaming himself began to lose their grip, replaced by a quiet resolve to stop living in the shadow of a past that had already taken too much from both of them. Jungkook placed the final document back on the table and looked toward Jimin with renewed certainty. Their greatest challenge was no longer uncovering every missing detail of the old mystery. It was making sure that no hidden manipulation, no matter how carefully planned, could ever again destroy the trust they had fought so hard to rebuild. Around them, RM, Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung shared the same understanding. Some questions about the past might never receive complete answers, but the future would no longer be written by silence, assumptions, or fear. As RM prepared to secure the anonymous evidence for further examination, another notification quietly appeared on the monitor. This time it contained only 8 words, displayed without a sender's name or any identifying information. The final piece was hidden where your story began. The room fell silent once more. Whatever remained undiscovered was waiting at the very place where everything had first fallen apart, and they knew that their next journey would determine whether the last unanswered mystery could finally be brought into the light.